Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified. I'm your host, Mark LaLiberty, and joining me today is...
Corey, where am I? Not grinding. Sorry, I forgot to think about one, so that's what you got.
Man, maximum effort.
There you go.
Should have had ChatGPT write one for you.
Exactly. That's a good point.
On today's episode, we will be covering, again, ChatGPT and some additional studies around it. Then we'll dive into some latest TTPs from a North Korean-backed threat actor. And then finally, we will end with a discussion of the CVSS, or Common Vulnerability Scoring System. With that, let's go ahead and, help Corey find his way into the episode. So let's start this week by beating the dead horse that is ChatGPT. BlackBerry, which I guess, pausing for a second, BlackBerry as a company still exists?
I know, right?
Didn't they get bought by they bought Silence.
Yeah. And by the way, what the heck they disappeared? Is Silence even a thing now? I sure haven't heard that name for 3 years.
No. Anyways, BlackBerry does still exist as a company, even if they aren't making their fun little physical keypad phones. Actually, crap, maybe they still are. I don't know. But they clearly still have a research arm of the organization, or at least a marketing arm, because last week they published a survey where they asked 1,500 IT and security professionals various questions around their thoughts on ChatGPT being used to drive AI-infused cyber attacks in the next 1 to 2 years. Starting with some of the key findings from it, I think Corey and I will both have some hot takes along the way. But from the stats from a few of the things they asked, first off, they said 51% of those asked predict that we are less than a year away from a successful cyber attack being credited to ChatGPT, and 78% believe it will certainly occur within 2 years. So pause at that one for a second.
I was only 5 years early on our prediction of that. I guess we didn't use the word ChatGPT, but we predicted AI-driven attacks quite a long time ago. But it is interesting to see it come closer to reality. ChatGPT definitely contributes.
Our prediction is AI-driven chatbots or something? And
I'm thinking of one even earlier than Mark that you may not remember, because I think it was before our dystopian Seattle video. It was another Seattle video where I was in various locations in Seattle, but this was very AI-specific, AI being used for phishing and stuff like that. Which, by the way, we'll get the stats on that one. Why don't you keep going with the survey?
Yeah, so 71% believe that nation states are already leveraging ChatGPT for malicious purposes. I doubt that they're leveraging it. I bet I 100% believe they're at least exploring it. I guarantee our government and other governments are researching what ChatGPT, or at least large language model machine learning algorithms, can be used in potentially nefarious activity. But actively
and I suspect
leveraging
the governments may have their own language models and AI algorithms beyond just this public open source one. So why, on one hand, why reinvent the wheel? I'm certainly sure they could use it, and maybe the North Koreas of the world that don't have the budget will. But I bet you the NSA has their own tools.
Yeah, I think you make a good point there, where maybe it's foreign to us governments, not United States doing it. I have to imagine the US, with their infinite funding for the military apparatus and their intelligence apparatus, have their own models where they're not feeding in their intelligence into this private company and instead using their own things.
Yeah, DARPA is known for doing grand challenges, spoiler alert. So I don't think they do those just for craps and giggles. That was me trying to censor myself. So I'm sure there's some sort of result of them paying out $1 million to have other people make AIs.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a little bit too. So The majority of respondents believed that ChatGPT will primarily be used for beneficial or like friendly uses, but a lot of them agree that there are potential malicious or evil uses for it as well too. Key stats from that one, going to run through it rapid fire. 53% believe that it will help threat actors craft more believable phishing emails. 49% believe it will be used to help less experienced threat actors improve their technical knowledge and develop their skills. 49% also believe it will be used for spreading misinformation. 48% believe it will be used to create new malware. And 46% believe it will be used to increase sophistication of threats and attacks. A few of those I agree with. A few of them I very much disagree with. And we
Which
talked
ones
about
are you
this.
disagreeing with?
So we talked about this last episode, the one before that, where ChatGPT is a very specific type of machine learning model. It's a large language model. It's designed specifically to understand the English language and human communications using it. And in that regard, it's fantastic. Like, it is very difficult to tell the difference between something output by ChatGPT versus just a human typing it up. In fact, I think it just passed like the bar exam for New York is what I saw recently. Like, it's clearly a strong model for human communications and like asking a question and getting a well thought out response. Large language models are not designed to write software code though. And yes, we've seen examples of it output very rudimentary and basic computer malware, ransomware, little code snippets. But at the end of the day, everything it's output so far is extremely basic because that's not what it's designed to do. So my thought process is totally makes sense for phishing emails and misinformation, but malware crafting, no, not so much, not with ChatGPT specifically.
I feel like it might help to create new malware for the script kiddies. Like I would, everything you said, I agree with, by the way, in general. I think that's why maybe the 46% to increase the sophistication of threats, and it won't increase the sophistication of malware. It will increase the sophistication maybe of spear phishing. But so I agree with you, it doesn't create good code, but there's a ton of script kiddies out there and they use crap tools all the time, and crap malware, by the way, does still work. So I could actually see script kiddies use it to make bad malware. Like, as you said, we know it can write code, rudimentary code, but when you're just learning and you don't know what to do, I could see them using ChatGPT to get some brute force crappy little rat out and then maybe learn a bit about the process after. But I do agree with you. It's not necessarily going to increase the sophistication of said malware.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like it can develop working malware payloads. In fact, it has, and it can develop just working. I've seen a lot of like sysadmins use it to create just PowerShell scripts to make their everyday easier. And they work, but they're extremely basic. And in the world of cybersecurity, like you just said, though, that it still works. We still see like Mimikatz used all over the world, even though it's like
Mimikatz is well coded. I mean,
yeah.
What's funny is seeing some really crappily coded old Delphi freaking rats still succeed. And sometimes the source leaks and it's just this 101 crap code that often has its own memory corruption vulnerabilities. But nonetheless, I mean, if you're sending a rat to a grandma, it doesn't have to be pretty code. Just has to open a back door.
So I don't think ChatGPT is going to be the thing that drives like malware evolution. But
Agreed.
That doesn't mean that like AI and machine learning aren't going to be used in that and aren't currently being used in that as well too. And we'll get into some examples of how AI is being used actively in vulnerability and attack management. But I do think there's a future where there's a AI model specifically developed to craft malware. I mean, crap, we see
Absolutely.
GitHub with Copilot right now can effectively write a full-on computer program on its own with very basic input prompts from the actual developer. It's one step away from just saying, hey, OpenAI, write me ransomware that, injects itself into another process. Like, I think it's probably fully capable of doing that. Hopefully there's guardrails on it. That'd be a fun research project to test at least.
I got to watch Space Odyssey 2001 again. That whole idea of, hey, Hal, write something to do this for me has become a reality.
I can't do that.
Truth is, he didn't want to do it. He totally can. or it.
Rounding out the research study, so 95% believe there needs to be some form of government regulation on ChatGPT or at least AI usage. 85% believing that responsibility is either moderate or significant, which, I get it. It's not really new, but it is a scary implementation of something that, like, I don't know, it feels very futuristic and it feels like we're moving faster than our ability to understand the ramifications of it. And that's
Oh,
typically where the
definitely.
government steps in order to help corral some of that too. That said, the
AI
cat's
was
kind of out of the
always
bag.
going to evolve exponentially, in my opinion. I mean, like we said before, we joked about how bad it was 3 years ago, but we also talked about it all comes down to big data. Like the more data it gets over time, the better it gets. Its worst version of itself is just an early period of time. It only goes up from there. So, yeah. As far as regulation, I don't know how. How do you regulate people writing code?
It's
I, you know,
well, I mean, so we do have some regulations in cybersecurity in that space, like export grade encryption protocols and things like that. I mean, the reality is, like, who actually follows those? I guess if you're a company based in the US, you have to in certain
that has
circumstances.
something simple and definable, like the strength of the encryption. 64-bit is fine, 128-bit or 256-bit is not fine. How do you grade AI models? Yeah, it's like you say. I think it's going to be moving faster than we can understand it. And damn, with our bureaucracy, regulations already slow. So I think the cat's out of the bag. But I mean, to be positive, I actually agree with the first thing. Chat GPT and AI in general is generally good. All technology is benign. It's just up to society and humanity to use it for good and tell people that use it for evil to screw off. So and to get rid of those evil folks. So it's a good old fashioned people problem. But I have hope that most of the world is still good and we'll use it to actually travel to Mars.
Maybe we've got a future where there's like some intelligence grading or test for like machine learning or AI models. And then based off the score, that's what you're allowed to, like, maybe
It's
we
already
restrict
passed
it
the
from giving
Turing
to
test,
Iran.
so we have to get it a little higher. It needs like what is AI Mensa? Because I guarantee you, it's going to be way higher than our Mensa grade.
And
Isn't like a score of 140 grade, and I don't know, but it's the Mensa top score 200. AI will be like in the 10 billions.
I mean, it's literally already passing bar exams and other what are supposed to be extremely difficult tests around the world. So it's crap. It's probably better than me.
The good news is I still think it's rather dumb. It just has all the data in the world at its fingertips.
And more every day as people continue feeding in and questions to it. Like, it learns from everything that people have been prompting it for the last 2 months since it's been out too.
Man, Megan, I just buzz marketed a movie that I just recently watched. That couldn't come out at a better time. If you haven't seen that movie and you're freaked out about ChatGPT,
Is that
watch
the
Megan.
little creepy doll thing? Yeah.
She's actually an AI robot.
Okay. Well, 0% chance of me watching that movie ever. So,
Mr. I Hate Horror.
exactly. I've been not suffering. I've actually been thoroughly enjoying the Walking Dead TV show, but that
Oh,
is
you
the
mean Last
exception.
of Us,
Not,
probably.
or
Last
not
of
Walking
Us.
Dead. Last of Us. Yes.
I
Walking Dead, I
can I
left
can read your
after
mind.
too many people died. Anyways, back to the topic though.
Digressions.
Yes. This is a security podcast, not a television review podcast. So this isn't the only implementation of artificial intelligence in cybersecurity, though. Like back in 2016, we were at that DEF CON specifically, where at
That was
DEF
a
CON in
lot
Las
of hardware.
Vegas, there was the grand finale of DARPA's Cyber Grand Challenge, where basically it was, I think, $1 million prize. They invited teams to develop artificial intelligence systems that could go and identify and exploit vulnerabilities in programs and software. They specifically had, like, they created brand new, fresh systems for them to go poke at with no at least publicly
Servers,
known. Yeah,
network services, and they both
exactly.
had the same network services that they had to both defend and attack.
And it was a team out of like Carnegie Mellon, I think. Their team
Yeah.
called Mayhem, I believe, that ended up winning it. So That's one example of using AI machine learning to actively attack and exploit things. But they actually had that AI machine. It was literally just a giant server rack full of
A
computer
bunch
hardware.
of them. Yeah.
They had it go compete in the human capture the flag contest at DEF CON that year, and it came in dead last. Now, it didn't come in last in like every category all the time, but it did at least receive the fewest amount of points. So it does seem to be like it's there and it's clearly learning. Although, crap, this was 2016. It's been 6 years. Maybe like half the threat actors we're seeing right now are actually built by this machine.
I think that might have been around the same DEF CON where we were making fun of the talk where someone wrote a script with AI that was just ludicrous. But I've read ChatGPT scripts 5 years later, and one day it's going to win an Oscar. So I don't know, man. I'd be a little scared of the DARPA Cyber Grand Challenge now.
Because it is like they are actively using this technology now, the US government is. Now, whether they're using it as readily as real human threat actors, who knows? But it totally makes sense that, DARPA doesn't do this for free. They're not just handing out millions of dollars.
That millions of dollars is because they want a defense fund. So that's why I alluded at the beginning that there are definitely nation states that are getting into this.
And we're not the only ones too. Like, so China had their own, what they called it, the robot hacking games starting in 2017, where actually that first, I think 2 years, they invited the United States, Russia, Ukraine to play in it too. But since then, it's only been Chinese universities and organizations invited. And it's at this point fairly closed to the public. So like, we're not the only ones poking around in this, which clearly makes sense.
There's good news, though. Remember, those AIs were actively patching 0-day in their own things. Correct, and I got to tell you what, I still can't get every admin to patch on time. So I think we need an AI to do your patching for you because most of the people I know aren't keeping up.
Yeah, with you on that. So, I mean, if there's anything to take away from this research study, like the reality is ChatGPT is fantastic at mimicking a human, and that will potentially have impacts on things like phishing or even misinformation was one of the topics they had. I don't think we're in a future where we have to worry about like the next 0-day being developed by ChatGPT specifically. There's other AI or machine learning models that may contribute to that, but ChatGPT at this point is just a fun little tool for creating human readable or human understandable conversations, I guess.
Got to tell you, we're down on cryptocurrency later, but if ChatGPT went public, I would buy.
Yeah. Well, crap, Microsoft's investing another $10 billion, I think, into it. And
Musk already did.
Search engine. Well, Musk kills everything he touches, so maybe that's not a good omen.
I hope Musk kills everything because I'm not a fan of his, but I actually am not sure if that's true yet.
I know. I'm jumping at the gun.
Tesla just rebounded with their price drop. Twitter seems to be thriving despite its crap, and it is utter crap.
Okay, fair.
People,
Jump the gun.
Humanity is attracted to crap. I go up and down. Humanity is great. We'll be fine. People aren't bad. Then I remember Twitter. Oh yeah, we're all screwed.
Yeah, that's a fair analysis. Anyways, moving on. So also last week, a cyber consulting firm called WithSecure published a actually very extensive report. It was like 35 pages detailing the latest activity from our favorite threat actor known as Lazarus.
I run a cyber consulting agency called Without Defense.
A for effort.
Sorry.
B minus for execution.
Good job with Secure. I actually like you. Sorry for the dumb dad joke.
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting and decent name. But anyways, moving on. So if you're not familiar with Lazarus, they are the North Korean state-sponsored threat actor that primarily focuses on earning revenue for North Korea. So they've been responsible.
Can you call it revenue? I'm sorry, if you're stealing, I'm not going to call it revenue. I don't give a.
I think it is technically still revenue. It's illicit revenue, but
screw that. I mean, come on, freaking what self-respecting country is going to resort to? Well, I know what self-respecting country, but I'm so irritated by it. I used to be able to say nation states are not idiots that attack like little script kiddie criminals. Get your head out of your butt, North Korea. Or
I think
actually
if
get your
there's,
leader's head out of his butt. Go overthrow that moron.
I think
Sorry, hot
self-reflecting,
take.
whatever is probably as far from the reality as it could possibly be with North Korea. But anyways, on the revenue earning front, they like to go after cryptocurrency exchanges lately. They've developed and released quite a few ransomware attacks, including WannaCry back in 2017, allegedly, most likely. But aside from the revenue earning for the
They
country
attacked
of Korea,
Sony Pictures because
correct.
of a movie pointing out how stupid that dude with his head up his butt is.
They
Sorry.
also do a lot of espionage as well too, primarily to improve North Korea's own knowledge on topics like healthcare and things like that. But as Corey just hinted at, sometimes they hack an organization just because they hurt their feelings. um, they've been making it pretty big lately though. So they stole $625 million in Ethereum last year by attacking the Ronin bridge. So Ronin, it's like a man, I guess time to dive into cryptocurrency for a second. So there's primary blockchains like
Yay!
Bitcoin, Monero, Ethereum, where those are the ones we're familiar with. They're easy to trade on a crypto exchange, so on and so forth. Downside of them is they tend to have higher transaction fees, and it can take a bit of time for your transaction to actually get confirmed on the blockchain just because they're the primary one. They are the most heavily used one. To counteract that, there's what's called side chains, which are basically alternative blockchains that track one for one with something. So like Ronin tracks with Ethereum. Instead of getting one Ether, you get one, I don't know what the heck it's called, Ronin coin, something like that. And because they're lesser used, maybe a little more tailored for a specific use, transaction fees on it are significantly less and confirmation times are significantly lower. So Ronin is used for a couple of video games called Axie Infinity and Sky Mavis. Which the fact that there's a cryptocurrency video game just grosses me out a little bit, but also makes sense.
With microtransactions. Yay.
Exactly.
I mean, I don't know, but I assume.
So basically, instead of earning Ether directly while playing the game, you earn like Ronin coins, for lack of a better word, and you can cash those out one for one with Ethereum at any other point in time. Or if you're in North Korea, you can cash them out to the tune of $625 million whenever the heck you want. Which was what happened about a year ago. More recently, in January of just this year, they stole $100 million in Ethereum from another side chain, this one called Harmony. So anyways, that was the background on North Korean Lazarus. But the report in this case starts in August of 2021, where WithSecure was brought in for incident response investigations with one of their clients. They identified malicious activity that started back in August 2022, where the threat actor gained access through an exploit of two known vulnerabilities in a Zimbra mail server. So Zimbra being an alternative to Exchange or what have you. They used those vulnerabilities in order to drop a web shell, which is how they kicked off the whole attack. With that web shell access, 2 days later, they dropped another larger tool for reconnaissance. Basically, it was like a file mapping tool for the web server. After that, they installed the P-Link and 3 proxy tools, which back in there for attribution, the 3 proxy tool they used was actually the exact same file, like exact same MD5 signature of another one used by Lazarus previously. They then exploited a known vulnerability in PKExec called PwnKit, which I think we talked about a year and a half ago when it came out, to escalate their privileges from local to root on the mail server. Then with that access, they started retrieving all email messages. They stored it in a single CSV, which then 1 month later, so this is like the end of September now, they exfiltrated that 5 gigabytes of data over SSH. Over the next month, which is now October, they moved on from the mail server to a vulnerable Windows XP client. So remember, this is October 2022. And yes, they are targeting a Windows XP client then. They also, alongside that, modified the login script for that Zimbra mail server to log user credentials into a text file. With their access on the XP machines, they harvested credentials by exporting the registry at the end of October. They accessed a second server around this point too, and were able to get a list of domain admins and domain joined computers. On that machine, they modified the W digest registry key, which basically allows or tells the Windows machine to store credentials in memory, so it caches them in memory. Very common technique by cyber threat actors, because then they can then use Mimikatz or other tools to dump the LSASS process memory and grab credentials right out of there. Then now in early November, they deployed a Cobalt Strike beacon to 2IP, so command and control back into the network, and ultimately exfiltrated 100 gigabytes of data from the network over a period of a week. All of this from a health research facility somewhere, actually, I think it was in the United States. So when it comes to attribution, there were a few things that ticked off with Secure on why this was likely Lazarus. So first off, that file they used that was previously used in a Lazarus activity. Much of the malware was actually used in other Lazarus-linked attacks too. But one of the big ones that I want to hit on. So one of the initial connections to that web shell first used an IP address coming from North Korea. So the connection was a single instance at the beginning of the current day that was both preceded by on previous days, as well as followed by, with a bit of a delay, on that day going forward, with connections from a proxy IP address instead. So North Korea only has 3/24 network blocks that are all directly controlled by the North Korean government. And so the connection coming from that IP, where they clearly recognized, oh crap, pulled it off, brought the proxy back online, and then connected through that with the same browser user agent, is a bit of a clear indicator that this was most likely a North Korean government threat actor, which in this case would be Lazarus. So using IOCs from their analysis, they found several other victims. There was a health research facility in India. There were other victims in health research, also manufacturers of technology that are used in energy, research, defense, and healthcare verticals, and then a chemical engineering department at a leading research university. So the report itself, like I said, 35 pages of very technical analysis of every single bit of tooling that Lazarus used in this attack. Really interesting to follow through on that. And a whole list of IOCs and other indicators from this specific instance against the health researchers. So highly recommend checking out the report in full.
Well, the activity's bad, but I'd never heard of WithSecure before, and this is a pretty dang full-ass report. Sounds like really great research. I haven't heard about them before. I mean, nothing strikingly new other than the fact that they're doing a lot of crap. It's crazy that, again, a North Korea nation-state sponsored threat actor is going this far into actual just criminal attacks like this. They know their techniques. I mean, they're using all the right things. Nothing seems super sophisticated or zero-day here, but they obviously know what they're doing. And, you know, a smart attacker with Mimikatz, PwnKit, and a few other things can easily get into a company that's not doing due diligence.
I think that due diligence is a bit of the piece of the puzzle too. So like one of the machines they targeted in October of 2022 was a Windows XP machine. So clearly out of date software in a medical research facility, mind you.
I'm not too surprised, though. I think you and I both know that, unfortunately, Windows XP exists. And actually, I would be less surprised governments target it, because usually the medical makes sense too, but usually you might find it in manufacturing or OT technology, critical infrastructure, because they have very specific, not proprietary, it's often from big name industrial control and manufacturing companies, but it's software that's made for a $100,000 piece of equipment that only, 100 people in the world own. So, you know, they make it when XP came out and never update it because it moves at the snail's pace. Some of that, something like a generator has a 20, 30-year life cycle. And I don't imagine they update the software over and over. So obviously that isn't necessarily what they targeted, but the same exact thing exists in healthcare. We've talked about it many times before. There are MRI machines that are probably running Windows NT below the surface. So I'm going a little far back, probably more like Windows 2006, but you know what I mean. So it sucks that Windows XP still exists, but the one place that, I mean, we can't entirely forgive the fact that it exists because it shows the medical and critical infrastructure industry is screwed up in the way they actually update their devices. But what can the hospital do? They bought an MRI machine that cost $500,000 15 years ago or 10 years ago, and they got to get their money's worth out of it. And they probably don't even know what version of Windows it runs behind the little built-in display. So yes, XP sucks, but it's there. Yeah.
And one of the other things though is like you said, there's nothing groundbreaking here. There was, in fact, a lot of it was just they had a web shell. They used that to install malware. There wasn't any fancy like living off the land attacks used in any of this as well too. Like all these were known threats where even just basic endpoint protection should have been able to catch a lot of this activity, let alone EDR tools that would have been able to catch some of the more sophisticated activity. Like it feels like a bit of I know it's victim blaming, and yes, the victims are still victims here, but like a little bit better protection deployment across the organization could have been the difference between this working and this not working. Plus, patch management, the vulnerability they went after was a known one that had been patched for quite some time. Yep.
I would rather, by the way, for the OT companies out there forced to use old crap, whether it has patches or not in its end of life, that's where you should actually consider older technologies like even point-based firewalls with complete, full egress filtering and ingress filtering, obviously, but very limiting things to lock it down when you have no other options but use old crap.
Yep. Either way, though, Lazarus is clearly still active and not just trying to earn money by hacking crypto exchanges. Stealing medical research information would be beneficial for North Korea, especially considering we're still on the tail end of it. Not even tail end. We're just in a reoccurring pandemic or endemic at this point.
Yeah. Pretty much anything that's unethical and horrible, bad for all of human society, and really kind of crappy. That's what the North Korean government wants to do. Good job, y'all.
Way to plant a giant target on our backs now. Because we know that they don't hack organizations out of spite for making them look
Someone has to call out the a-holes or they'll continue to own the world, as I think
Correct.
A lot of political countries have figured out.
100%. Moving on to the last bit. So just last week, the vulnerability intelligence firm VulnCheck released a research analysis where they reviewed some accuracy issues in the CVSS, or Common Vulnerability Scoring System, of vulnerabilities in the National Vulnerability Database, which is maintained by NIST. So the report they released, it's not exactly like full of tons of information, but I thought it'd be a good opportunity just to talk about the CVSS scoring system, how it works with measuring vulnerabilities, how organizations can use it to help prioritize the response to vulnerabilities, and how organizations shouldn't use it just on its own to prioritize their response and remediation to vulnerabilities. Before we jump into that, though, I think we probably need to go over another real quick acronym, CVE, which stands for Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures, which is a reference method that was created and still maintained by MITRE. I mean, we talk about CVEs all the time, but basically it's the way to add a single tag that everyone in the industry can understand and know, okay, this proxy logon issue in Microsoft Exchange Server is CVE 2021, blah, 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 or whatever. Something that Corey and I have lamented we wish we had more actively used around the industry for threat actor identification as well, too.
Yeah,
but,
although it's good to know that they're using the MITRE stuff now.
MITRE actually has
MITRE has some stuff now.
Yeah. Threat actor numbering system as well. So anyways, CVEs.
The easy button for idiots like me is it's a score of 1 through 10, and 10 is bad. That's all I need to know. But as Mark will tell you, the people that actually are smart and technical, that 1 through 10 isn't just arbitrary. It's actually very quantitative. So it fits great for the technical nerds, and it's the easy button for the idiot just that wants to know, By the way, no, you're not idiots. I love you all in the audience. I'm not an idiot to you. But if you don't have time, we just want to know. Oh, shut up, Mark. Is proxy login bad or not? Is log4j bad or not? It's great that there's a way that gives everybody an easy answer to that while still having very quantitative attributes that make it accurate.
So yeah, like Corey just said, CVSS scoring, it's on a 0.0 to 10.0 number, where when someone submits a CVE to via MITRE or via their own CNA to the National Vulnerability Database.
CNA, what is that, Mark?
Certified Numbering Authority, someone who is allowed to issue their own CVE numbers, or at least authorized by MITRE to do that. When they go to this database, NIST does their best. NIST, I guess another acronym, National Institute for Standards and Technology. NIST does their best to give it a CVSS score based off the description and information in the vulnerability, but they're not the only ones that can submit a CVSS score either. So this research study was basically VulnCheck went in and reviewed all 120,000 CVEs that have a CVSS version 3.0 or 3.1 score. There's multiple versions of CVSS. They change the model they use somewhat regularly. CVSS 3 or 3.1 right, being the most recent one. So they found that of those 120,000 CVEs, around 20% of them had both a primary and a secondary score from NIST and another vendor. And 56% of those had scoring conflicts. So like NIST would say it's a 9.8, the vendor would say it's a 7.2. Of all the vulnerabilities in the NVD, NIST is the primary source for 97% of them. Basically, if you submit something and it doesn't already have a CVSS score tied to that CVE, NIST will go in and try and come up with one on their own. And for the most part, they're relatively accurate, but the issues that arise are when NIST has one score and someone else has another, and you as the IT or security practitioner doesn't know which one to use because they're different. So before diving into like that and some ways to potentially tackle it, we should probably go over first, like how does the CVSS scoring system work? So the latest version, it's 3.1 technically.
Oh, let me explain it. You see, every year when a company has a vulnerability, all of MITRE comes together and watches a hole in the ground for this little furry rodent to come out. And if the furry rodent sees a nuke in the air, it gets a 10. Right, Mark? That's it.
Yeah, that's it. Episode over. Crap.
By the way, Groundhog Day is the stupidest thing ever. Why are we still doing that? Anyways, how are CVSS scores really quantified?
So they actually have a model with what they call vectors. So 8 different, or I guess not vectors, metrics. 8 different metrics where you have a various setting in it, I guess, for lack of a better word. And then based off of the value for each of these metrics and a little bit of math, they come out with a number of 0.0 to 10.0. So those 8 metrics, the first one is the attack vector. So is this vulnerability exploitable over a network? So like any network, most typically the internet. Is it only exploitable via a adjacent network? So you have to be network exploitable, but on a local one, not a public one. Is it only exploitable with local access to the machine itself? So like malware or a user logged into that machine? Or is it only exploitable with physical access to the machine itself? So as you might guess, like physical access would lower the value, the ultimate score, quite considerably, whereas a network attack vector would allow it to reach up to a 10.0. Next up is attack complexity, and there's only 2 values here, either low or high. And basically what it means is a high is it requires something outside of the attacker's control in order to succeed, whereas a low is the attacker with reasonable certainty could exploit it on the first attempt. So an example of a high might be, it's a memory overflow that only happens when also this other activity is occurring on the system. And so they have to time it just perfectly in order to be able to read a byte off the buffer. Whereas a low it's just a simple exploit where you exploit a string and it goes and gets you remote code execution. The third metric is privileges required, which is either none, low, or high. So do you need to be authenticated? If you are authenticated, does a low user privilege work, or do you have to have administrative or system level access in order to exploit the flaw? Obviously, no authentication would raise the value, the final CVSS score, whereas requiring high levels of privileges would lower the potential ceiling of the score. Next up is user interaction, which is either none or required. Basically, does the attacker require someone else to do something in order to exploit it? A score of none would be like they go in and just exploit the flaw, whereas cross-site scripting and cross-server request forgery all typically require user interaction of some sort. Like cross-site scripting, yes, you inject something, but you need a user to go visit that page to trigger the code, script, whatever, and actually damage the system, for lack of a better word. Scope is one that's a little difficult to wrap your head around, at least in my opinion. But the scope metric is either unchanged or changed. And basically the way to explain this is we're talking about vulnerabilities in like a system or a module on a system. So like the authentication component for Amazon.com. Maybe it's got a vulnerability in it that could give you code execution. When you exploit that, is your the activity you're allowed to, or I guess the impact that you're causing on the system limited to that one component? Or with your exploit of this vulnerability, can you impact a wider set of components on the system? So unchanged versus change, being unchanged is you're limited to the thing you're attacking. Change means by exploiting this vulnerability, you can gain access to a wider system. And then finally, there are the three impacts on the CIA triad, as we call it in security: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So for each of those, by exploiting the vulnerability, what is the impact on them? None, low, or high. So it might have, like, let's say you have the ability to like Heartbleed as an example. So Heartbleed was a vulnerability where you send a specific packet to a OpenSSL TLS web server, and it will respond back with a chunk of memory off of that server. It doesn't crash OpenSSL. It doesn't crash the web server. Doesn't allow you to change any data, but it allows you to read a chunk of memory off of there. And so the impact to availability would be none. You're not crashing the server. The impact to integrity would also be none. You're not changing any of the data on the server. But the impact to confidentiality would be high because you're able to effectively read the entirety of memory off of that server. An impact to integrity would be like a denial of or availability would be like a denial of service vulnerability. If you exploit this, it crashes the process. You could do it over and over and over and stop someone from being able to use it. An impact to integrity would be like if you're able to modify a database through a SQL injection flaw, where you could change the data within that system, that would impact the integrity of the data in there. So basically, depending on how you fill out each of these values, like network attack vector, high complexity, low privileges required, low impact on confidentiality, so on and so forth, gets fed into this calculator, this calculation, that then spits out a number of 0.0 to 10.0. So back to the research study, they found that using cross-site scripting and CSRF as an example, the user interaction should always be set to required. But they found that 1.1% of primary sources and 15% of secondary sources did not have the user interaction metric for these types of issues set to required. So basically there was an issue in the calculation that they did, that scoring vector, which caused the calculation to be incorrect for that one specifically. So like CVSS, it's simple yet also complicated. You have to understand it in order to do it correctly. But at the end of the day, it spits out a 0.0 to 10.0 number that makes it simple for IT practitioners to act on it and use it as a piece of prioritization. That said, though, like CVSS on its own shouldn't be your only factor for prioritization. There's other things out there too. Like, is there exploitable code out there in the wild for this vulnerability? Or is it just a theoretical issue? Because like the reality is, you know, a 10.10 or 10.0 out of 10 vulnerability, it sounds scary and critical, but if there's no actual code out there to go, if there's no one actively exploiting it, it's potentially less severe than like a high that does have known exploit code that is being actively exploited out there in the wild. So We've actually seen, like, in our vulnerability management tools we use internally at WatchGuard, like ones advertised by other providers too, just using the CVSS on its own is actually falling out of favor. And now they're taking in information like, what's the criticality of the system itself? What is the maturity of the exploit code out there? And using that to factor into the scoring to ultimately spit out a more accurate number and help you prioritize your remediation. Funny enough, so CVSS actually kind of takes a little bit of this into account itself too. So that was the primary metric group I talked about, those 8 little things that you can do to set a score. There's actually 2 different additional metric groups that you can use to modify that score as well too. There's the temporal metric group, which is somewhat rarely used, but still there. It's basically for things that change over time, but would be consistent across all environments. So like there's the exploit maturity or exploit code maturity, which is either unproven, proof of concept, functional, or high. So basically for this vulnerability, is there exploit code available, and how good is that exploit code? Is it automated, or does it still, like, it's theoretical but unproven? And that can affect the score as well. The remediation level, so is there a patch available for the vulnerability? If so, is it a temporary fix, a official fix, or just a workaround? That could affect the score. And then what is the report confidence? So for the vulnerability, they've accepted it, they've given it a CVE, but how confirmed is the actual report? Has the vendor come out and said, yes, this is an issue? Has the security industry decided, yeah, this seems reasonable, or is it unknown? So these temporal metrics you can tack on to those original 8 and modify the score as well too. And then the third group is the environmental metric group, which is meant for individual organizations that lets an analyst customize the CVSS score depending on the importance of the affected asset within that user's own organization. So specifically, you set like these new metrics for CIA, so confidentiality, integrity, or availability, based off a specific system that this vulnerability might be on. So is that for that system, if this vulnerability were exploited on it, for your organization, what would the impact to integrity or availability or confidentiality be? Like, is this a business critical system where if the availability of it, if it's taken offline, that's a critical impact to your company? Then the environmental metric for availability would be high. Basically, this is a way for you to take a existing CVSS score, apply it to one system in your organization, and set these different values for that specific system to change the score, and again, help you prioritize remediating this issue. So that was me talking a lot. The reality is CVSS on its own is a great starting point. There are ways for you as a practitioner to take these temporal metric groups and the environmental metric groups and use CVSS with a few other settings to give you a more realistic number of how important it is. But on the face of it, like 0 to 10 makes it easy for it, where if you don't have the ability to go in and do all that, you at least have something to help you prioritize issues. And I think that's actually pretty great.
If you know there's caveats, I think it's good enough for some situations. Like something might be a 10, but if you, I don't know, have it internally on a test system without there could be caveats. But I would rather people at least pay attention to CVSS, if nothing at all.
Correct. And there are going to be situations where the scoring's different. It was about a month ago we talked about that JSON Web Token vulnerability that has since been revoked. But at the time,
way, good job on that prediction, Mark.
I totally called that.
The industry
I don't think I explained
caught up
it well enough. So I guess tangent time. With that vulnerability, it was they believed they could get code execution in a really popular library for managing JSON Web Tokens. But the analogy I came up with after we finished the podcast is, so the issue is it's not in the library, it's in the implementation of the library. And so my analogy that I ended up using after that was, consider the JSON Web Token library, it's like a blender. You can put anything you want into a blender. It's meant for, like, put fruits in it to make a smoothie, put, like, I don't know, what else do you put in a blender? Peppers in it to make salsa. Ball bearings, yes. But you can put your hand in the blender and it will run. It will blend your hand up. That isn't a vulnerability in the blender. That is a vulnerability in your implementation of the blender.
Your
So
brain.
the library, yes, they could have controls to stop you from putting your hand inside of it and turning it on. But the reality is it would take other poor coding practices on your part in order to have a
Although if it's
vulnerability.
like McDonald's coffee, someone will sue them and they will have to put a control as in a sticker on the drive-through window telling you hot coffee will burn you.
Correct. Yes. And that's basically what open, or what was it, OAuth, Auth0 ended up doing with their JSON Web Token library. They put some barriers, some guardrails around the inputs to this function to stop people from intentionally spilling the hot coffee in their lap when they were using it. But long story short, there was a petition by even more passionate security researchers out there than me that ended up getting the CVE revoked by GitHub, and Unit 42 has since corrected their blog post on it. But when that was still an issue, NIST had it graded at like a 9.8, whereas Unit 42 had it at like a 7.8 or something because of discrepancies in how they calculated the CVSS scoring. And that's going to happen. I'd say, honestly, if the vendor is on there, they are typically the ones that know the most information about the vulnerability. So there's a higher likelihood that their scoring is more accurate. Whereas NIST, all they know is just the description of the flaw itself in that CVE record. And they kind of have to guess based off of that. So if you do see a conflict, like just keep that in mind if you're still trying to prioritize it. But either way, like CVSS, it's a fantastic system and it does make all of our jobs a little bit easier, especially when paired with other metrics for how to actually prioritize responding to a vulnerability. So either way, cool report from VulnCheck. Well done on their part. Hey everyone, thanks again for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. If you have any questions on today's topics or suggestions for future episode topics, you can reach out to us on Twitter while it still exists. I'm at XORRO_. Corey's at SecAdept, and the both of us are at #the443podcast. Thanks again for listening, and you will hear from us next week.